Well, welcome, and thank you again for coming to this virtual event focusing on the presidential transitions in the new Biden administration, sponsored by the Institute of Politics at Florida State University. My name is Hans Hassell, and I'm the director of the Institute of Politics, and I'm delighted to be hosting and moderating this event. This event was slated to be the second of the IOP's series of events celebrating civility. Unfortunately, our first event had to be rescheduled due to some last-minute scheduling conflicts with Senator Romney and Senator Manchin, but we're optimistic that this event will be rescheduled in the near future. The Nonpartisan Institute of Politics at Florida State aims to promote civil discourse, civil engagement, and a greater understanding of our democratic institutions by conducting relevant research and educating both students and citizens about the political process and encouraging responsible civic engagement. This program tonight fits perfectly into that mission, highlighting the importance of the peaceful democratic transition of power and what goes on behind the scenes to ensure that transmission is smooth. So thank you to our guests and also to you in the audience here for being here this evening. Towards the end of the program, we'll open it up to the audience to ask questions. You can enter those questions at any time during the program in the Q&A box, which should be available on in the Zoom window there. And we'll get to as many of those as we possibly can if you have questions to our panelists or about presidential transitions in general. We're privileged to have with us tonight some individuals with extensive personal and scholarly knowledge on the topic of presidential transitions. And I want to begin by introducing them and thanking them for being here. Jon Carson is currently the founder and managing partner of Trajectory Energy. Prior to that business venture, Jon served in a number of key roles in the Obama White House and was the national field director for the Obama campaign and then the executive director for Organizing for America. Most relevant to our discussion tonight, Mr. Carson was also a member of the 2008 Obama transition team. Willie Gaynor is the founder of Rock Creek Advisors, LLC. He is a veteran of both Bush campaigns in 2000 and in 2004, serving as finance director for the Western United States in 2004, and served on the 2000 and 2004 inaugural committees for President Bush. Most recently, in 2016-17, Mr. Gaynor served as the director of the presidential transition for the U.S. Department of Commerce for the Trump transition team. And lastly, Gary Hollibaugh Jr. is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. He received his PhD from the University of Rochester, and his research examines the decisions of appointees and unappointed bureaucrats once in office and how executives and legislators respond to electoral and institutional constraints when choosing individuals to serve in appointed positions. He is the author of an impressive array of articles on these topics published in the top academic journals in political science, and is the co-author of a book, More Than a Feeling, Personality, Polarization, and the Transformation of the U.S. Congress, published with the University of Chicago Press in 2017. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us this evening. To start, I'd like to give each of you a few minutes to just briefly introduce yourselves and to highlight anything that you think is important for our audience to know about presidential transitions and about your own experience and research as that may apply. After that, we'll jump into a discussion about presidential transitions and the current transition in particular. We'll start first with Gary, and then over to Willie, and then Jon. And when you're done introducing your introductory remarks, please just don't wait for me. Just jump right in with the next person. So, Gary, if you want to start us off this evening, that would be great.
A pleasure to do so. Thanks, Hans, for the introduction, and thanks to the IOP for hosting me and my distinguished co-panelists. It's really a pleasure to be here, the virtual format notwithstanding. So anyway, we're here to talk about the transition from the outgoing Trump administration to the incoming Biden administration. It's really an important time. Lots of personnel are changing. Lots of information is being gathered on the part of the Biden campaign. Lots of policy reorientation is in the process, and so on and so forth. Really, a lot of stuff overall happens during transitions, and there's no way that any of us are going to be able to cover all of it, even if we had more than just the hour. So for my part, I'm just going to cover one or two points, and then I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed co-panelists. Anyway, as Hans mentioned, and thank you so much, I should hire you to be my hype man. A lot of my own academic research is on executive appointments. And so when I think of transitions, I think of them through that lens. So, the transition teams, have limitations. I mean, they're not terribly large relative to the broader administration. So, for the Office of Presidential Personnel to identify and vet candidates for the 2,000 to 4,000 non-judicial positions subject to executive appointment, the count varies depending on time and how you classify certain positions. There's just not enough time, nor is there enough personnel to identify everyone before the new administration starts. And then, of course, there is a Senate confirmation aspect. There's often other legislative business that hinders the ability of the Senate to confirm nominees quickly, assuming the Senate wants to move quickly at all. And I'm sure that given certain recent events, you could probably think of some other matters that might be occupying the minds of those in Congress, and in particular the Senate, given the events in the past couple of days. So because of that, and not just because of impeachment trials, but just the fact that there's a finite amount of time and personnel, presidents have to prioritize which positions need to be filled first, either because they're important to the broader function of government, like, for example, cabinet positions, important to the incoming president's policy priorities, in which case you might see earlier staffings of lower level officials in the agencies relevant to such policies, important to reorient key agencies away from the policies and preferences of the previous administration, often more of an issue when you're dealing with party changes as well. Important because agencies in question have more ability to unilaterally affect policy without the assistance of Congress. For example, how much of Biden's plans are doable via executive order, or some other reason. These sorts of positions, in general, are probably those likely to be filled first. And if I'm incorrect about that, I'm sure my fellow co-panelists will drag me for that. But anyway, as an example, consider the Reagan transition. It happened against the backdrop of an economic crisis. Pendleton James, who was Reagan's director of personnel during the transition until '82, there was a pretty famous interview in which he noted that they focused on positions relating to economic issues because of the context of the time. And I'm sure you might guess that economic issues aren't just within the purview of a single agency or department, but there are, lots of positions throughout lots of different departments have some sort of relevance to economic issues. Not just Treasury, but everywhere. So what they did was they came up with what Pendleton James called the key 87 positions. Other than the cabinet, they knew that those were the jobs that needed to be focused on in order to get things up and running, so that as Reagan issued proclamations or executive orders or other directives, the agencies could actually carry out the policies. Other presidents have done similar things based on the important issues at the time, and I expect the Biden administration to be no different. Of course, as mentioned, many of these key positions are subject to Senate confirmation, and an impeachment trial is almost certainly going to delay confirmations of at least some people, though President Trump demonstrated that the president does have some latitude to unilaterally appoint acting individuals, but whether or not President-elect Biden plans to use the same authority, at least in the short term, is yet to be seen. But regardless, once the Senate is able to focus on confirmations, I expect them to move pretty quickly, given Democratic control, as well as the relatively recent abolition of the filibuster for all appointments. Control of the Senate is going to give the president-elect some additional flexibility when it comes to deciding who to nominate, since pure party line votes will break his way with Harris as the tiebreaker. But of course, the transition is about more than just deciding which person X fills position Y. It's an important period of information gathering and refinement of policy goals and policy implementation procedures. For example, the president-elect recently announced a goal of providing 100 million Americans with the COVID-19 vaccine within 100 days. That's a lot, and that was always going to be a heavy lift. But since that statement was made and the incoming administration has gathered more information, it's become apparent that more work than expected might have to be done to meet that goal, in part because they only recently gained access to the centralized federal government database that monitors vaccine distributions. So, similar happenings are likely going on in other policy areas as the incoming administration learns more about the current state of agencies, though there have been reports that the Biden administration hasn't been receiving regular briefings from some agencies, so that might hinder them a bit later on. But regardless of what happens, learning more is going to allow them to refine their policy goals, refine their implementation plans, and hopefully allow them to get, start off the block relatively quickly and help the new administration hit the ground running. So that's it for now. I'll have more to say about these issues later on, but I want to turn things over to my co-panelists at this point. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Gary. My name is Willie Gaynor. I've had the privilege in serving in 2 transition periods. One in 2001, which was led by a bunch of former executive branch leaders who had a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge. We only had about 32 days, and it was an incredibly hectic and uncoordinated transition. I then had the privilege of serving in 2016 and 17 in a transition where it was led by people with very little federal branch, executive branch experience. And actually there's now a consulting group, awesome consulting group, who serves as an advisor to both candidates, both sides. And it was incredibly well run. And so what's interesting about those two, and I'll credit Jon, who's going to speak here in a minute, but a lot of the transition between administrations is, even though it's been going on for over 200 years, truly a transition team and a formalized transition is a fairly modern phenomenon. And a lot of the progress that has been made really grew out of the transition between Reagan to Bush in 1988, 1989. And not a lot of people know this, but that was an incredibly rocky transition. And it was because a lot of the Reagan folks said, we're not leaving. And the Bush folks all wanted to come in and implement their policy, just like what Gary was just saying, is that there's a whole policy agenda that the new administration wants to come in. They want information. They want to be able to use that information to help implement their policy through the executive branch. Well, that was a very, very difficult transition. And then fast forward to the one that I participated in 2000. And it was, again, a very difficult transition. It was an incredibly contentious election. Actually, many of you may not have even been born, frightening as that is. And Jon and I worked on opposing campaigns in 2000. But it came down to 537 votes in Florida. And that was very hard. That was very hard for the country. And it was finally decided by the Supreme Court, as many of you now know. But that transition, we had 32 days. It wasn't decided until about, I think it was December 12th was when the Supreme Court ruled. And from then on was when we allowed to formally start our transition. And that experience led President Bush to ensure that in 2008, they would do everything they could to make the transition for President Obama as quick and seamless as possible. And President Obama then took that baton and ran even further with it. And in 2010, they passed a law through Congress, really establishing presidential transition as a codified deal run by GSA. And when we got there in 2016, it was incredibly seamless. And I give the folks at the Obama administration a tremendous amount of credit, and the career employees a tremendous amount of credit. Now, before I turn it over to Jon, I know this is political science, but I'm a little bit of a numbers guy. And there are roughly 12 million federal employees. Now that's military, contractors, all of the above. Rolls down to about 2 million full-time employees. Incoming President-elect Biden will have roughly 4,000 political appointments. So that's less than 0.5%. And 1,200 of those require Senate confirmation, which means those folks aren't going to be working on policy issues. They're not even going to be in their positions for several weeks, if not months. And so the transition it's messy, but the good news is there are professionals that run these departments. These departments can essentially run themselves, but it's the political direction that President-elect Biden and his team will give that will shape how the executive branch focuses its time for the foreseeable future. So with those thoughts, I'll turn it to Jon.
Excellent. Thank you, Willie and Gary. And first, let me thank Hans. I think it's such a smart idea that the Institute of Politics did this session focused on transition because I think it's just one of the more overlooked, but just absolutely crucial periods that determines the success of a presidency. And I will say, I think I had the privilege to be part of what was probably the best transition in modern times, really because of President George W. Bush tasked his team and they executed flawlessly a fantastic transition. 12 years ago tonight, I was in the thick of it. It was about this time that I was finding out what my position in the administration would be, and really just starting a new chapter in what had already been a long run. I joined the Obama campaign. Well, to go back a little further, as Willie pointed out, I probably would have had federal government experience earlier if it wasn't for those 537 votes in Florida. I worked for 2 years for Al Gore. We didn't win. I then worked for 2 years on President Obama's campaign. We won on a Tuesday, and I had a few days off, had to report for duty on the presidential transition the Monday after the election. I was out of the GSA office in Chicago, where the then president-elect was still living and where he was. So I had a tiny little cubicle in a federal office, and every once in a while, the president-elect would walk by with some governor or senator who was going to end up with some appointment. So I had a little sneak preview on how all that was going. My particular role was I was the campaign liaison to the transition to the personnel team. So I was tasked with helping 5,000 well-deserving organizers, field staff, and other campaign staff find appropriate places to be a part of the federal government. The vast majority couldn't. There aren't that many positions, and the priority is obviously on people who have both a mix of experience, but also a network in the team. You know, Gary has talked a little bit about really what is, of course, the most important role of transition, which is the top appointments, the Senate confirmed appointments. But I'll mention a couple other aspects that I just think make transition so incredibly crucial to the success of a presidency. Well, there is, of course, a set of people who need to be named, get the Senate confirmation process going at the beginning. What is also happening in those few short months is you're creating the plumbing for the staffing of the whole rest of the government. You aren't going to appoint every last deputy chief of staff, every last scheduler, but if the transition does its job right, it has vetted and created a pool of people to pick from. Because a really important part of staffing that comes later is, you know, you might have a governor who didn't know the president-elect before they became a cabinet secretary. Well, they better have a chief of staff who does know the people over at the White House. Creating those connections happens if you're able to set that plumbing up during the transition. The second thing that happens is, honestly, most of the details of the important legislation all happens before January 20th. The Recovery Act got passed less than a month after the president got sworn in. Trust me, most of those details were hashed out in little conference rooms with the transition and members of Congress. And then there's another component that happens called agency review. And again, because of just the wonderful way the Bush people did this, we were given an open door policy to go in, review what the current status of career staff, of different regulations at different points in the pipeline were in the administration. I was the chief of staff at the White House Council on Environmental Quality for the first 2 years of the Obama administration. And as soon as I found out that was going to be my role, it was an incredibly smooth process to find out the gentleman who had that role for the Bush administration. He met with me 3 times, walked me through how everything worked on the budgeting end with OMB. I'll never forget, Marty took me across the street. The Council on Environmental Quality is in these fantastic old townhouses on Lafayette Square. Marty took me over, showed me how the White House mess worked, showed me the really important stuff, like how to make sure you knew how to access the White House mess, how to give a good White House tour. 3 times he met with me, and it really got us off and running on a really great start. And so again, having that plumbing of personnel so you can staff the rest of the government as quickly as possible, the legislative work that happens ahead of time. And then finally, I think one that is a good example for the Biden administration, Of course, an enormous effort is put into the most important cabinet agencies and getting them up and running. But if you look at the climate agenda, the clean energy agenda that President-elect Biden has, lots of little agencies are going to have a lot to do with that. Perhaps one of the most important is one that Willie mentioned you may not even know about, General Services Administration, GSA. It's the largest asset management entity in the world, I suppose. And if you can take advantage of getting those little agencies up and running early, if you can staff out the regional administrators, a part of the federal government that's often overlooked, you can give the administration such a head start.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm looking forward to our discussion here. I think kind of as a kickoff, one of the things that we should immediately talk about here is that the events of January 6th. Well, those events have left, I think, a lot of people concerned about the democratic institutions that we have here. And I think a question for you is, should we be concerned about the stability of our democratic institutions, and how can a transition team help restore some of that faith and trust in those institutions?
I can jump in first. I think my answer to that would be maybe we always should have been more concerned about the stability of our democratic institutions. Maybe that's something that we just sort of have taken for granted, but always need to be focused on. I was a Peace Corps volunteer for 2 years in Honduras, and so I've lived in a place that didn't have democratic institutions. But I also think as much complicated and negative stuff has happened, we had the highest turnout in over 100 years in this last presidential election. So we're starting from a place that an overwhelming majority of Americans still believe in democracy. But I do think we can't take any of it for granted and need to constantly be working on it. I do think the Biden administration understands that. And I think a great example of it was when they started the transition and GSA had not actually certified that they would get the transition funds, dozens of friends of mine and hundreds of people overall quit what they were doing and were volunteering full time to be part of that transition without any pay.
Yeah, I mean, John, I'll second that. I mean, I think obviously the events of January 6th brought a lot into stark relief for a lot of us, and it was a horrible thing to see. And following on a very tumultuous summer, I think it just showed that there is a lot of division, there's a lot of strife. But one thing I do believe, and having been in DC for a long time and having tremendous friends on both sides of the aisle, you see repeatedly that the institutions are stronger than any individual, and that the foundations of our institutions are incredibly strong. And I give the president-elect tremendous credit in how he has approached nominating his appointees for the heads of the departments. I think when you look at just this strictly from a transition lens, the most important thing that the Biden-Harris administration can do is nominate good people, is work closely with them to institute their policy and really have people that can explain their policy. In the way that the world is divided right now, roughly 50% of the people aren't necessarily going to agree with your policies. But if you get out and explain why they're important to you and why that's the direction you're going, most rational people will have faith that you'll execute on what you want to do, with whether or not they agree with it. And I think that's kind of the most important part of the transition, is really communicating, putting good people in, and being transparent with the public about what you plan to do.
Yeah, I would generally agree with my co-panelists. One thing that I think John was alluding to a little bit is we've learned, relatively recently, just how much of American political life is based. We have a lot of basis on institutions, but a lot of it is actually based on norms. And one of the things about changing norms is that a lot of it isn't going to really be apparent at the time it happens. We're not really going to see whether or not a norm has changed until we've seen it happen with more than just one president. Because if it happens under just one president, well, we can maybe just chalk it up to that one individual. But if it starts to happen under more and more and more presidents, well, then we can say that that's actually become a trend, and that's actually resulting in a changing norm. One example might be the increasing executivization of American politics, with more and more power being gathered inside the White House as opposed to the executive and legislature. But that's been a long process, going back at least until FDR, if not before. So, I mean, I would like to say that, we found that our institutions are strong and nothing else. But what I think a more nuanced, what I think the answer is that we found that our institutions are strong. Jury's still out on the norms. We'll find out in a few more years. So maybe in a couple of years, Hans will invite us all back and we'll re-answer this question.
Yeah, I think the norms, just to pick up on that, Gary, I think the norms are always gonna change, right? I mean, it just because, with the advent of technology and with the advent of how the government operates and how the government grows, I think those norms are going to shift pretty quickly. I would put in one last thing where I think where I have a lot of faith in what the Biden administration will do, and I think Jon can probably speak more intelligently on this. But not theoretically, Biden's really only been out of executive power for 4 years. And so he's going to be surrounded with a lot of people who have distinct knowledge of what his policy agenda is, who have experience within the federal branch in terms of leadership and policy execution. And I have a feeling that if those people aren't going back in directly in leadership positions, they will certainly be folks that will be involved, and those who do go in will lean on them for advice and execution expertise. And so I think what you're going to see out of the Biden administration is going to be a wildly competent group who's able to set an agenda and start executing fairly quickly. Again, it's going to take them a while, even with the Democratic Senate. It's going to take them a while to get their Senate confirmation people in. But I think, Gary, you alluded to something earlier about Reagan, the 87 most important positions. I suspect the Biden folks know who they want in their pipeline of people, which is something that Jon brought up earlier, who are going to be on the ground, come whatever the first Monday is after Thursday, the 20th. And there will be folks on the ground and in who can operate and work well with the teams that are already there.
I'll actually tell you a story about that cohort, Willie and Gary. There's almost this sort of class of people who the Obama campaign in 2008 was the first thing they ever did. When I worked on the Gore campaign, it felt like the only people who wanted to come work for us were a bunch of college Democrats. But on the Obama campaign, we had people who had gotten architecture degrees, economic degrees, engineering degrees, got out of college, worked on the campaign, and spent 8 years in the Obama world, maybe on both campaigns, maybe part of the administration. For the last 4 years, they've been off doing other things. Some of them went to work for governors. Some of them went to work on the Hill. Many of them went to the private sector, philanthropy, nonprofits. They're all about 35 now, 34, 35, and there are dozens of them who are going to be part of this Obama administration. None of them are going to probably get a Senate confirmation. Very few are you hearing about, but they are this cohort of people who have deep experience in the federal government, but now 4 years out in the rest of the world. I'll just tell you, and for me personally, being part of that 08 transition, it's really fun watching their stories. I'll tell you one quick example of this. My job on the transition in 2008 and 9 was, someone would get some appointment and they needed some very junior staffers, some schedulers to come in. So I sort of had my list of state directors and I'd say, okay, Brandon, tell me your best 3 people coming out of New Hampshire. This is your turn. And I happened to have, I needed some staffers for OMB at the time. And I called my friend Brandon Hurlbut and he said, okay, there's this one young guy, you have to get him a job. Allie's 80. And so Allie became a special assistant, which is basically just a scheduler for one of the program area directors, a PAD at OMB. By the end of the Obama administration, he had his boss's job. He was a PAD at OMB. And if you watched President-elect Biden, roll out his climate team, Allie is going to be the deputy to Gina McCarthy. And I could tell you a dozen stories of people like that. None of them are going to get a Senate confirmation, but they're just this cohort of people. It's really funny, Willie. I would love to actually hear more stories. I'd heard rumors about the Reagan to Bush transition, that it was actually pretty rocky. It's almost like we have almost sort of a 4-year delayed Obama to Biden transition that in that sense will probably be smoother than the Reagan to Bush.
I hope.
So the other piece of news that I think is important for us to just to kind of talk about here is the impeachment, right? So the House yesterday voted to impeach President Trump, and my understanding is that the trial in the Senate will not occur until after the Biden administration begins. So what sort of impact do you guys think that this will have on a smooth transition, right? Will this be a significant problem to the Biden administration, or is this just a blip in terms of not really that big of a deal?
Well, I'll start. I'll let Gary will jump in at some point because he's going to be the most intelligent on this, being a professor and a student of this.
I don't know about that.
But my view on it is it's going to be a great hindrance to the Biden agenda, and it's going to be a completely unnecessary distraction. And I believe that because I believe the Senate, which is now controlled by Democrats, should be focused on getting Biden's people in and executing on the agenda that the president-elect wants to work on. I may not agree with the agenda, but I believe that is the best way, and that's the best use of the Senate's time, is to work on the agenda of the incoming president, as opposed to worrying about impeaching Trump. And the problem with it is that it's going to take a lot of time. I mean, it really is a trial, and I don't know if we remember the last one, but it's hours and hours of Senate debate time on the floor. The Senate is one of the great bodies that's able to spend a lot of time doing nothing. It's really a debating society, and when you add a whole set of, and it's all procedural, so it has to go through these procedures, it's going to take a massive amount of time away from which I think is something much more important, which is Biden's agenda. And I'm not sure to what end, because you have to get 3/4 of the Senate to convict, and that's going to be difficult. So just from a straight functional, forget the politics of it, just a straight functional exercise, I think it's going to hurt the president-elect going in, because it's going to, at best, he's going to have to spend 50-50 of the Senate's time on his agenda versus the impeachment. So that's sort of my 2 cents.
Yeah, I mean, I alluded to this earlier. The current majority leader, Mitch McConnell, has said that Senate's not coming back until the 19th, and the most likely outcome is that any sort of impeachment trial starts within a couple of hours of the inauguration. And as Willie just said, I mean, these things take a lot of time. It's while it's possible that Senate committees might be able to start reviewing nominees and holding hearings and what have you, they're going to be distracted because of this, impeachment, the trial hanging over their heads, and the Senate floor, where we actually have the up or down votes, as well as the pro forma cloture votes. That's going to be focused by and large, at least for the first few days or weeks. I don't really know how long the trial is going to last, because Schumer's going to be running things at that point. They're going to be focused on the trial. So it's going to slow things down for at least a couple of weeks. And one thing that I think is, beyond that, I mean, things were already going to be contentious because of the current environment. Things are also going to be contentious because of the fact that it's split 50-50 with the vice president as tiebreaker. This is going to further inflame tensions and make it harder to get any sort of bipartisan buy-in for the Biden agenda. Whether or not you think we should have bipartisan buy-in is one thing, but Biden has indicated that he wants a lot of his big policy priorities to have bipartisan support, and this is just going to make it that much harder to some extent. Now, this says nothing about, whether or not the impeachment and trial is a normatively good thing. I'm not going to wade into that right now. But in terms of pure logistics, this is not going to be very helpful to the president-elect.
I think I've got a slightly, I actually agree with everything Willie and Gary said, but I have two different other ways of looking at it. So it's absolutely going to slow things down. You'll probably see Schumer will work him as hard as he can. You'll probably actually see the top nominations get through, the secretaries get through. The part that's just going to be absolutely stymied is assistant secretaries, deputy secretaries. They need a committee hearing. They can't do the committee hearing because they're in the trial. It will slow that down. That being said, the drag on the Biden agenda from this is not in the same order of magnitude as if the Republicans still controlled the Senate. So this is, and then there's another side of it. I think that if the House wouldn't have impeached at this moment, I think if we, whatever cost the Senate trial is going to have, just speaking as a Democrat, the Democratic Party, the Democratic base, there would have been this absolute turmoil over why didn't you do that? How could you not see that as a moment that you had to do that? And that has a massive drag as well. That churn and that angry conversation. And I think that there was some debate over that, but Pelosi passing impeachment and getting 10 Republican votes, I think if she hadn't have done that, our party would have just been torn apart by the debate over whether or not she should have.
So, John, one of the things that I think that you also have sort of mentioned is that it's not so much the top level positions that are going to get slowed down here. It's the sub level positions. It's the undersecretaries and so on. What sort of impact does that have on the ability of the administration to get its work done? I mean, is it? I guess how much of a role do those individuals play in managing the pipeline of policy?
It's massive. It's massive because we aren't going to get, Obamacare style size legislation done with a 50-50 Senate. Maybe we'll get some extra COVID relief. I could see some compromise on infrastructure, but we're not going to have a year like we had in 2009 and 10 legislatively. And so, look, secretaries aren't the ones who sit around and write regulations. It's the assistant secretaries. It's the assistant administrators. And that is stymied. We had this, there came a point where it even got slowed down when we lost 59 votes in 2010, that we had assistant secretaries. A particular issue that mattered a lot to me is the Clean Water Act. I was at CEQ, I wanted to see us rewrite the regs. There was this crazy three-way tie Supreme Court decision under the Bush administration. Couldn't do it because we couldn't get our assistant secretary of water through at EPA.
Yeah, I just, I've done quite a bit of research on this, and John's absolutely right. It's that second level tier of nominations that has the unfortunate combination of being extremely important to the president's agenda, but also not so high profile that the president can, use what minimal power the bullet probably has and try to, convince the public to support his agenda. It's one thing if you're trying to, get the public to support a cabinet nomination. Those are really high profile, and that just looks bad for the Senate if they, slow those down too much. It's another thing if it's like some really, 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 really low level nomination that no one really cares about, and the Senate doesn't really just want to spend too much time on. But these second level ones, those are where a lot of the sausage is actually made, and those are the ones that are going to be slowed down the most because there's the most incentive to slow them down and the least ability to really do much about it from the president's side.
Well, and I do want to go back, Hans, if you don't mind. I want to go back to something that John said earlier, which I think is important, and this is something true for everybody who's in the Zoom that I presume most are students. Politics is an interesting game, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on. And John made this point earlier when he talked about the assistant who came in and then took their boss's job and is now going to go back in and be a number two, not a Senate confirmed, but a number two, and is going to be where a lot of the sausage is made, right? Where a lot of the policy is implemented. Politics and working in on campaigns and working in both, this, we're talking about the federal government, obviously, but state government is the same way. It's a role where no task is too small and no task is too large, right? As you get in, you'll see people who are potentially going to be Senate confirmed, changing paper in the printer, while at the same time, working on massive legislative goals. And you as a young staffer are in the room for that. And the amount that you learn and the vertical trajectory of what you can do and what you can absorb working in some of these places is tremendous. And so for those of you who are interested in this, I think, one thing to take away, and I think Jon's story is a great one. And I know several. I mean, I got my job by asking then Governor Bush for it in a photo line. I was going to go work at Goldman Sachs in New York and literally asked for a job in a photo line. 2 weeks later, I was volunteering down in Austin, Texas. But that's kind of the story of how a lot of people get engaged. And you can really learn a lot and do a lot and advance a lot of the things that you're passionate about. You can get better experience and knowledge. It's like a second education going in. And so I think that's just one of the points I wanted to make, because I think lost in sort of the transition talk and what's going on with Trump and Biden and all the rest. It's an important and it's exciting field to work in.
So the other kind of piece of news that I think is important to just address is this, the concerns that were raised at sort of the beginning of the transition that some of the Biden transition team was not getting briefings from the Pentagon and other offices, the Office of Management and Budget. And it's debated how much of an exaggeration this was or was not. What sort of impact can a lack of communication between those between the two administrations? What sort of impact can that have on policy and their ability to move forward and advance the president's policy there?
Well, I can jump in first. I think a pretty significant one. And again, I'll go back to the transition that I was a part of. President Bush and his whole team was gracious. They were open book. And another part of transitions that's overlooked is it's the first moment that the new political leadership is working with the career staff of these agencies. And the transition I was a part of, that was a huge piece. Some agencies like EPA, we were shifting the priorities fairly significantly. And those 3 months to interface with career staff led to really big things. We sort of had a phenomenon I like to refer to as the memo in the drawer. You had a lot of career staff who maybe under the previous administration, some issues they cared about weren't being forwarded. Well, even during the transition or in the first few weeks of the administration, when I was at CEQ, I had someone from EPA call up and say, so in the last year, I wrote this Chesapeake Bay executive order. Do you want to take a look at it? 4 weeks later, we had it signed by President Obama. And so even just that missed opportunity, which, Trump, Biden aside, I think a lot is probably being missed just because they're doing a lot of this transition over Zoom. I do think it will be a hindrance.
Yeah, I'll follow that. I slightly disagree in a couple ways, mainly because the most salient point I think Jon made, which is dead on, is that it really is the first time that the politicals get to work with the careers. And that is critical because those are the people who know how the departments work, how they operate, what existing policy is and what they're doing to execute it, and then how you can slightly steer the ship if you want to go in a different direction. As far as the secure briefings and a lot of that stuff, look, I did commerce, and some of the people on our transition team were very concerned about being in the secure briefing. And I said, you don't have clearance. You don't need to know, because one sort of really important point about the transition team is you're a guest. And I credit Secretary Pritzker and her team because they were phenomenal hosts. But their political team really wasn't that engaged. I think Jon's made a good point of saying, like, he did the outreach or they outreach to him. And that was great coordination. That's why that was one of the smoothest transitions. At Commerce, I had very close interaction with the secretary. I didn't bother her because she didn't need to be bothered. But the deputy secretary, Bruce Andrews, was phenomenal. The chief of staff, Jim Hawk, is another amazing guy. And I really also only talked to them when I had questions that I felt needed answered. The rest of it was working with the career staff and getting an idea of where things were. Because as guests on the transition team, you have no ability to implement policy. You have no ability to change what's going on at the department until 12/01 on January 20th. And, I've worked with people who didn't really know that and people who did. And so one of the great things, and again, I'll credit the Obama folks with this, is they very much understood what our role was. And thankfully, we understood what our role was as well. And so that allowed everybody to work together very cleanly and getting stuff done. But in terms of not having access to information, there's some information that you actually just don't get access to until 12/01. And in the secure briefings, and that's with law enforcement, military, DOD, the rest, that happens pretty seamlessly. That's not at all what GSA was talking about. And at no point was any of that held up. So that's the really critical stuff. The rest of it was kind of just noise. What needs to be transferred is transferred.
So there's go ahead, Gary.
No, I was just going to say, I think that between the two of them, they provided a really, really excellent coverage of the question, and nothing I can say will add to that.
So there's a question that an individual asked that I think is relevant to this, and this question about the slowdown of the transition and how much of this is directed from the top, and how much of this, how much slack do individual agencies have in their ability to provide or choose not to provide that information, and is there variation across agencies in terms of their willingness to work with an incoming administration or not, and how much of that might be top down, or how much of that might be individual agents, agency heads making choices and decisions about that transition phase?
I would actually, go ahead.
Well, just a little more context on all of this. The short answer to that question is it can vary, but presidents usually, I think both Presidents Bush and Obama really directed their cabinet secretaries to take this seriously. But let's give a little context about what this information is. So the regulations that they're working on, those are no secrets. The budgets that they're executing, that's all public information. A lot of the information gathering is, what's the status of the career staff? How many vacancies do you have? What's the status of these various offices? So I do want to give that context of exactly what you're looking for. It's not, the new administration coming in has their own priorities that they plan to put in place. So a lot of it is actually sometimes just more straight logistics.
I would actually like to hear specifically Willie's take on this, given that he was involved in a delayed transition and the GSA not signing off for over a month after the election.
Yeah, that is a good point. The GSA didn't sign off on the Bush-Gore transition until deep into December. And there were, I think, and I was one of the last added to this, there were, I think, 4 of us that went into commerce before January 20th. And we were directed by Don Evans, who is just a wonderful, wonderful American, who was our commerce secretary. And he was sworn in on the 20th. Very close with President Bush. But he went in and he said, all right, you 4 go in. He said, be as polite as possible. Know that you have absolutely no role whatsoever. You are going in to just get information about where the elevators are, where my office is going to be. And he goes, I understand we have a lot to do with fish. Find out about that. And so a lot of it is, but commerce is a different, commerce is sort of the front hall closet of the government. I don't mean that to belittle commerce. It just has a bunch of sort of disparate agencies in there. But an agency that not a lot of people know about, which is an incredibly important one, which is the Department of Energy. It has very little to do with fossil fuels. It has almost everything to do with guarding and securing the nuclear stockpile. And a friend of mine went in to be the chief of staff over there for Rick Perry. and they needed to be there on the ground early on, but he had to go get his clearances re-upped, and that took time. That took working with the Senate. So there was a natural delay in the information, and that's called a Q clearance. You don't even read about it. But that just took time. Now, the great news is there are institutions and there are things in place that make sure that there is a continuity of government, and that the transition and those truly important issues, that the professionals stay and make sure the baton is passed. And so while I think that there may be, and I actually don't even want to speculate on how the politicals are getting involved in this transition. It really is the professionals, and this is fairly codified. The professionals at the department and the career staff are the ones that lead the transition with the incoming political team. And they know that this, and I think what the Act of 2010 really did, and Gary, you can probably speak more intelligently, but it really took a lot of the politics out of it. It made it much more professionalized and much more institutionalized, in that it is the career staff welcoming in the political staff and showing them the ropes on what the building does. I mean, a lot of secretaries, I'll stick with commerce, what I know, Gina Raimondo, who I've worked with her office in Rhode Island. I went to college in Rhode Island. But I guarantee you that she doesn't know that the two main jobs of commerce are counting people and counting fish. And, when I told that to Wilbur Ross, he did not think it was nearly as funny as I thought it was. He said, I'm going to work on trade. And that was their priority. And that's what he's gone on to do. But the Commerce Department still does count a lot of fish and count a lot of people. And it's important that is really, and the Act of 2010 and really I'll go back to where I started, which that Reagan-Bush rough transition, George W. saw that firsthand. He also saw firsthand the difficult transition in 2000. And so he made it a priority. And there's actually now a center for the presidential transition, which is two of the most senior people on it are people I've had the great privilege of working with, Josh Bolton, who was Bush's chief of staff at the time. And Bush said to him, make sure this is the best transition in history. And I think John is proof of it, that it was. And then Penny Pritzker is the other, who I had the great privilege of interacting with, and she was phenomenal in ensuring that her team, regardless of what they thought of the new politicals coming in, that they were to hand over the keys and get them whatever they needed to make sure that they could run the department.
Yeah, as both of them have said, and I think I forget who actually mentioned the 12 million career employees, but you have a couple of thousand politicals, and you have several million career civil servants. Those 12 million people are going to be there across administrations. They're going to be the ones actually doing the day-to-day jobs of counting fish, for example. They're going to be the ones who are actually going to be teaching the politicals how to do their job when they're in. They're the people with the institutional memory, and they're the people who actually know how to run government. So, in terms of the day-to-day running of the government, there's not going to be much, if any, effect. In terms of, the new president-elect being able to quickly implement it as policy priorities, well, there's going to be a small delay, but the day-to-day function of government is going to proceed without any sort of hiccups. And there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve anyway, because all of these several thousand people that are going to be appointed as politicals, they need to learn how to do their jobs, and they're not going to know how to do that on day one. So there's a learning period either way.
Yeah, and there's now it's now very formalized in the sense that, and I know we didn't have this in 2000, but we had great briefing books, and when I went up to first brief Wilbur Ross on this, he was reading the annual report for the Department of Commerce. And I don't know if you ever read the annual report for a government agency, but there's really not a lot of information in there. It's reading a corporate annual report's pretty boring. Reading an agency annual report is mind-numbing. And so the career staff and the leadership within each division within the Department of Commerce, and this is true across the federal government, had written what the ABCs of what each division did, and then what the major policy priorities were, what was being executed at the time, and then what was in the pipeline, so that the incoming team could know what to expect, what was going to happen, and what was coming down the pike, in terms of decision making and in terms of just strictly where the department was headed. And all of that stuff couldn't have been more helpful in terms of educating the teams coming in on where things were. And that was all part of what Bush and Obama coordinated. And then I think Obama helped lead into law in 2010.
I'm going to try to get to a couple of quick questions here before we have to wrap up. One of these questions, two of these questions ask about whether or not the Senate confirmation process adds something to the quality of the nominee, referencing a number of nominees that perhaps were not as well fit for the position, or were political appointees for a variety of reasons. And then kind of the other question of, should we reduce that number? Would it be helpful to administrations if we were to reduce that number of people that had to have appointments from the Senate, or confirmations from the Senate, I should say?
This is a perennial debate, but I'm actually in favor of the current system. I think it gives a deputy secretary, an assistant administrator, first of all, if they're going to be in that position, they ought to be able, they're going to deal with tougher things than running the gauntlet of a Senate committee hearing. You know, they're in charge of making regulations around a given area for the entire country. So I think it's an appropriate gauntlet to run. I'm hopeful. I think that there is somewhat of a chance, maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I think we might get back to the days where at least a third of the opposition party votes for your average assistant administrator, deputy secretary, and moves along. But I do think at that level, going through that process is appropriate.
Yeah, I actually agree with Jon. I think it's part of a great system of checks and balances where the Congress has a say on who gets to lead the executive branch. I think that's important. I think, unfortunately, the process is only as good as those who lead it. And so, you know, you see some examples of, I think, and to Jon's point, which I think is a great one, is they're going to face tougher challenges in getting through a Senate confirmation hearing. And, you know, I think I was reading in the Q&A, someone asked about, you know, Michael Brown, who, you know, heck of a job brownie at FEMA. How did a guy who ran a horse running association get to be the head of FEMA? Well, the Senate confirmed him. You know, that's that. And then you've got another guy like Tom Daschle, who is probably one of the best public servants that you can think of, who was nominated to be Obama's head of HHS. And because of a mistake he made, you know, filing tax returns, he had to withdraw his name because he wouldn't make it through the Senate confirmation process. And so I think it's a double-edged sword. You know, politics comes into it, and you see some really good people who should get through, not, and some bad people who aren't qualified get through because they can pass the Senate. So, you know, it's imperfect like sort of the rest of our system, but I think, you know, having those top positions require an extra level of scrutiny, I think is a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, like, given the fact that we have a separation of power system, that, you know, the executive and the legislature are separate branches entirely. We're huge. We're a huge country. We, you know, are involved in a lot of policy areas at the federal level. I mean, having the amount of appointees we have, political appointees we have, is, I don't want to say essential, but it's extremely useful for dealing with the fact that the executive legislative relationship is an inherently political one, an inherently tense one, and being able to get through the gauntlet, as Willie called it, is, you know, helpful at a minimum for helping navigate that. It also, you know, helps, you know, yeah, sometimes bad people get through, sometimes good people are denied, but that's true of any personnel system. And it allows for a additional check on, you know, the kind of people who are appointed. It allows for more information to be brought to light, and allows for, like, let's say, for example, Dash have been appointed and then the tax stuff comes out later. Is that better or worse than what happened now? So we have to think about what the counterfactual is. Well, what would things look like if the president were able to appoint all those positions himself? Arguably, probably not as good, because there's less of a political check on what is inherently a political relationship. So I think that addresses both questions. I agree with both of them.
So just as a concluding question, so I think that we've done a lot of talking about the transition. I want to end with this one. This is from Brittany. She says, as a young person working in politics, how can we help others who are not working in politics better understand the process during these salient times?
Well, I think one, and I'll start because people are probably tired of hearing me, so I'll be quick. I think they would be surprised at how well people who work for opposing campaigns get along, and how well people who work for opposing, I don't want to throw this at the media, but because we have a 24-hour news cycle, and half the job of our elected officials now is getting on camera and saying something, and using that to get reelected and all the rest, you forget that the people who actually do a lot of the work really do coordinate and really do respect the differences of opinions and really do work hard to make sure that, what they're passionate about, if it's good if it's good, they work on it. And in order to get anything done, you really do need help from others. We're at a place right now where it's incredibly divisive. And I think, recent events, the election, all of it shows that there's a huge division, but also, I think that Jon made the point earlier that this was the highest turnout in election in 100 years. And that a lot of the people who do this for a living work very, very closely with one another, regardless of their political affiliation, regardless of their belief system. So to people who work in politics, I would really encourage you to, one, reach out to people across the aisle and get to know them. I guess we can't really go to lunch anymore at the moment, but engage them as often as possible and engage in exchange of ideas. And then also let people outside of politics know that it actually is a fairly civil profession, or it can be. And it's necessary. It's from the state level all the way up to the federal level. And so the more that people can go into it, and this is true of anything in life, but with an understanding of those and a willingness to work with those who you may not agree with, that's really one of the most salient points of working in DC that I've quite honestly enjoyed.
I would really second what Willie said. So much of politics that you're watching on TV is hyper partisan, but the actual just nuts and bolts of getting the Social Security checks out, running the VA hospitals, counting the fish it's not bipartisan, it's just totally non-partisan. But to specifically answer the person's question, I don't know exactly how you can necessarily do it by watching how national politics is played on TV. So maybe try taking them to a city council meeting, taking them to a zoning hearing, show them just the nuts and bolts of how decisions are made. Why are there no curbs and gutters on this part of town and that part of town looks great? Maybe watching national politics is not the great entry point. And in fact, on the Democratic side, one of the reactions to President Trump being elected that I thought was really interesting was in 2018, you probably saw at the national level, a lot of people running for Congress, a lot of those seats picked up. But what was more interesting to me was all the young people who said, my reaction to what's happening nationally is I'm running for city council. I'm running for the school board. I can't tell you how many fantastic, 22-year-olds are on school boards, city councils, and a young woman in Travis County is now in charge of the whole county because of that reaction. So maybe start local would be my thought.
I completely echo the start local point. I mean, one of the things I talk about in my class is that the vast majority of governmental decisions that affect your day-to-day life are made at the local and state levels, not at the federal level. You have many, many, many more local governments, many, many more state governments, and they tend to be much more amicable than what makes for really good TV, which is, conflict at the federal level. Also remember that government is political, but politics and government are different. There are 12 million government workers at the federal level. They're not all hyper-partisan. They're busy sending out checks. They're busy counting the fish, and they work with appointed leaders from both parties. So I think the common thread between the three of us is that it helps have a sense of perspective over what's actually going on. What we see on C-SPAN, because of the incentives that these members of Congress and other high-level political official space, that's not government. That's just a very, very, very small part of the governing apparatus. But look local, that has much more effect on our day-to-day lives for the vast majority of people.
I guess that's maybe not an appropriate way to end a panel on presidential transitions, but I think that's where we'll start. I want to thank Gary and Willie and Jon, especially for joining us this evening and elucidating on their experience in presidential transitions and how these can be an important component of our government. And it's been wonderful to have you here, and thank you so much for being a part of the Institute of Politics and joining us this evening. So with that, we'll conclude. Thank you guys so much, and thank you to those in our audience who have joined us this evening.
Thanks so much as well. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, everybody.